Hello everyone, today we continue our inquiry that we started last week regarding the resurgence of priestly warrior power in medieval Europe. I gave a pretty broad introduction to that video. We will, if anything, give more, like in terms of topics variety to that, because these topics are pretty big. I don't want to play the meme. This is the introduction to an introduction. But it's obvious that in order to address such a pivotal phenomenon in Western civilization, one has to be pretty thorough about every single aspect, going step by step. All right. Today we go on. Like in the first video, we essentially, this is not even supposed to be like a single episode per se. It's more like different aspects, if anything, of the same topic. Nothing is strictly consequential here. However, there is still a chronological order that I was just hinting at. And we have to enter the Renovatio Imperii from, obviously, the Franks. I made a video that shows how even before the Carolingian period, the Merovingians had largely fulfilled what had been an imperial mission in Western Europe, right? They had largely stabilized the same. They had become the irradiation center of Roman evangelization from Italy across basically northern, central Europe and beyond. At a point, there's a very strong partnership between Clovis and the papacy. So that's a major pillar, right, for the aforementioned imperial and ecclesiastical bond that, as we learned, was historically united in one, right? And that both universal authorities somehow, and rightly so, from a strictly metaphysical and theological point of view, claimed not just the respective one that we're more habituated to associate them with, but also a part of the rest. They both had spiritual and temporal prerogatives in different ways, by different degrees, but unavoidably so. If you missed the previous episode, just know that there is a Renovatio Imperii playlist, and more importantly, an Imperial Catholic traditional one, if you're interested in this stuff. There is also not much an imperial history per se in the West, but if you search for the Franks or the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottonians, these transitional phases, you can find everything you want, for not talking about Christian history, history of theology, history of religions, the history of the church, the papal states, etc. Today, provided that, again, we're not trying to cover every single aspect of this dynamic, if not on the channel broadly meant. So obviously, in each video, we have to sort of concentrate on specific aspects that can complete the wall that we are delineating with this work. I want to discuss the Battle of Poitiers, right? Or at least in part referencing to it. This is also known as Battle of Tours, where in 732. And as everybody knows, basically, this was a pivotal clash. In fact, near the holy sanctuary of Saint Martin, that was as such the patron of France. We're in the heart of France in many ways, more from the Atlantic side, nevertheless on a frontier area close to the Loire. So what had historically been the boundary between Neustria and Aquitaine, and even before, in fact, the Visigothic kingdom, as a matter of fact, that was reached by the Islamic hosts of Cordoba. The Frankish infantry and cavalry, as a matter of fact, because never underestimate how advanced, even before Carolingian times, Western cavalry already was, under Charles Martel, the de facto ruler of the Franks and grandfather of Charlemagne, used disciplined shield, walls, and terrain to decisively hold the northward advance of Umayyad Muslim armies from al-Andalus, led by al-Rahman, preserving Christian dominance in Western Europe, and later mythologized as a defense of Christendom. As a matter of fact, local historians, chroniclers, mostly from the ecclesiastical background, would provide us with a relatively controversial idea of Charles Martel, because he had, in this de facto proto-Ghibelline Guelph struggle, affirmed much of his power in the revival of the Frankish Empire rather than monarchy by confiscating lots of episcopally held territories that had been effectively usurped from the public domain, and therefore royal power, sacred royal power, I would like to stress, in the previous centuries during the decline of the Merovingian period. And the Battle of Poitiers, in this sense, is a reaffirmation, or not just on, let's say, the Islamic foes that represent this broader south and Pelagian force under a religion that, as we've seen in a recent video on probably the Islamic Holy War, denies theosis, incarnation, right, has a pretty detached sense of human participation to divine power, or basically like transfiguration into the divine itself, while the Latin Germanic civilization was championing true Christianity that actually has that. This is radically important. We stressed it in that video as well. Nor the Muslims nor the Jews actually have theosis. In this sense, Judaism is something in between, where you have essentially a Holy Spirit, a divine spirit that descends into people, right? But it's something very different from the proper accomplishment of divinity that Christ symbolizes. And so you want to appreciate also how and why Christianity affirmed itself in Europe historically, right? And what the Indo-Europeans actually, because the Trinity, incarnation, theology, it's all there in Indo-European theology. So Christianity, in this sense, is something very differently from how some people try to depict it as a sort of, especially of a quote-unquote Semitic legacy, whereas it's actually a Catholic religion, just like the Indo-European ones. And as technically also Judaism and Islam were being, or at least for Islam, it's a bit complicated to make that case, and Judaism as well has some limits, but in a truly universal sense of power that informs every element of creation, right? And so there is a convergence in an overlapping of beliefs that normally in the online discourse of sort of pseudo-historical criticism of religion, of theology, of cultures, of identities, ethnicities, does not get properly recorded. The Battle of Tours is, in this sense, actually very telling, because you know that, and we'll make a video, properly a tactical reconstruction, as we often do, like through primary sources of specific battles, as opposed to our also the times and meaning of that battle is more of a historiographical reflection of the same, the cultural relevance, etc. There is a depiction of the Franks, properly the infantry array, that appears like frozen, so rigid, so still, so resistant, that it's as if this men of the north, as far as you can argue that the Muslims, and also part of their Christian subjects at that point were men of the south, held their ground and won, in fact, also with a cavalry countercharge, the Battle of Poitiers. We never know 100% how the battle unfolded. We have very scarce information in general, as I was saying also in my recent video about Charlemagne, and or at least what was the Carolingian heavy cavalrymen under Charlemagne. We have no way to reconstruct battles during the entirety of the Carolingian era, right? Only the Battle of Zunta provides us with an actual, okay, we know more or less the position, the forces, how the battle unfolded. For the rest, it was God decided that this was the winner. And for them, and this is extremely important, for them it was enough, and it was actually more important. Like people complain because modern and secular-minded people think that history is just some sort of mechanistic materialism. It's way more important for the Frankish chroniclers to tell us so few about this, but especially that this was a divine contest, fundamentally, between the commanders. It was not merely God again deciding, right? Remember this. It was also who had the virtue, in this sense, the Holy Ghost, the Imperium, the Victoria at the end of the day. Then any technical description of how these battles would have actually been fought. Like, this speaks volumes of probably the mentality of these people. And so in this regard, according to the perennial metaphysical outlook of these peoples, that kind of austere, hieratic as well, rigidity, discipline, authority of northern France, as the Western Frankish kingdom would later characterize itself, its mystique and theology. We talk about Montjoie, Saint-Denis, etc. You have a true Asgard, you have a true heaven, and so something unmovable, something truly frozen, like those Frankish warriors on the plains of Atlantic Gaul, successfully withstanding this sort of hot, devilish onslaught from the south. This is very important from an archetypal point of view. That is how this was appropriately understood. Obviously, many people would say, but are you sure about this? Where is the evidence? Well, if you have followed my work, you know that when we look, like in this case, at the battle, this was a battle naturally about which much was written, probably overwritten, right? And in fact, I don't attribute to this. It was surely an epoch-making battle in some ways, but there were lots of other battles that were fought at the same time that get no coverage, also because later historiography did not sort of fully embrace their meaning or whatever. So I'm not one of those people say, Tours is sort of the most important battle, like Christianity would have died, like the West would have taken over by Islam. No, that's not a thing. A Frankish defeat at Tours would have been a pretty serious thing for all what we just listed. But it's more shrouding these historical events in the proper context that we derive from, as you've seen from our History of Theology series, about all what we kind of know about these world's spiritual, religious, traditional background and divine understanding, metaphysical outlook on life, right? So that is an important step. I recently made a video also about early Carolingian warfare that documents, in fact, all the various accounts of the main campaigns, at least of Pepin of Herstal, Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, etc. This opening, ushering in probably a new era of leadership that will be recognized, in this sense, sanctified and Romanized by the papacy, right? First, by essentially legitimizing the Carolingian, the Pepinid Arnulfing line over the Merovingian one that had been sort of lost into even literally made up successors that acted as papas in the same Carolingian hands. And most importantly, Charlemagne's imperial restoration, in the sense, a Roman imperial coronation in 800 AD in the Basilica of St. Peter. If you go to St. Peter, by the way, very few people know this, that of course, like the church, as you know, was built during the Renaissance. There is still, however, some aspect of the previous basilica. It was actually beautiful. We have sort of extensive sort of evidence of how it arrived, in fact, itself until the Renaissance. And still, when you enter, on the left, there is, and because the pavement is not actually symmetrical, on the left, there is a porphyry circle, right? Pretty red circle on the ground. That is the same exact porphyry stone where Charlemagne kneeled as he was being crowned by the Pope as a Roman Emperor on Christmas night, Christmas Eve of 800 AD, right? And this is something just for telling you how close history is actually to us and how much of this meaning is there, naturally porphyry and as purple, as properly recalling not just the imperial authority, but the hematophilia that the Franks were so deeply imbued with, the blood spilling of the passion, that the bands of Clovis were sort of ecstatically dreaming of in a transcendental trance in warfare as holy war and self-sacrifice and sacrifice of the same enemies on the altars of God, as much as their own swords were also sanctified on the same, and carrying relics in their hilts, etc. And so you can see a brutal continuity that I also discussed in a video about probably the vocation of Franco-Roman civilization, that is the axis, right, the imperial ecclesiastical axis of Western civilization in this period. And the reason why I'm talking these things may not be immediately and readily evident to you, but bear with me, because we're gonna get to the point, and I think this episode will take a couple of other videos, but I'm not sure entirely. Charlemagne does not need to be presented, especially in his imperial accomplishment. I mean, he expanded his realm through the Saxon Wars, the Lombard conquests, the other campaigns, and as such, he was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day. I mean, obviously, political alliances, mutual interests, that are never merely sort of temporal. They have a deep spiritual meaning. In fact, at this point, popes recognized, it happened under Louis the Pius and so on, that not just emperors had a power on the church as much as they had to protect it, but that in this sense, and this will go on for a while, the royal prerogative was also sacred in nature, right? This is a bit like what was happening in the Byzantine Empire, where a Sebastocratic autocrat was truly incarnating Christ on earth as also ruler of the church, right? Already at this point, the West had naturally a much more actually functional split. This will end up in the East actually repressing the Byzantine church and civilization in its sort of moral potential of ecumenic expansion. The popes themselves had successfully won their own metaphysical autonomy from the Eastern Empire, and now we're brokering with the Franks a new deal that, however, was truly in line with the imperial Catholic Holy Apostolic recognition of earthly and heavenly power, that being enormous in the person of Charlemagne as a true sort of imperial, nothing from the time of the Roman Empire had been this great in the West, right? And we often, probably don't in pop culture realize the scale of Charlemagne's conquest just per se, in a truly European sense. Concluding, for example, the conquest of Germany, the sort of the expansion in the Slavic world as well. There is a lot about the mentality of these men. Charlemagne's being obsessed with King David and God, Lord of battles, descending properly among his men during combat. There is all an epos that, as you know, flourishes in the later centuries. At this point, was largely oral, not just the Germanic epos of the previous centuries, but the new what will become the chanson de geste, the matters of France, so to say, that were telling, in fact, the deeds of men who fought and died, such as Roland himself, at this very point, like at the fringes of what was re-expanding as an ecumenic empire. The reconnection here, the Renovatio Imperii in the axis, France, Italy, is brutally reinforced and actually stabilizes great part of what later medieval Europe will be basing its success on, right? It's difficult in this sense to explain the subtle difference that exists in the West between this mutual recognition of power and a simple subjection. Popes kneel themselves in turn to emperors, recognizing their sacrality. This is something you don't see, especially from the sort of the investiture controversy onward, right? There is a moment of Frankish and Ottonian, so Carolingian Ottonian subjection, of the papacy that, in fact, eventually sparks a reaction. But in the West, this relation was always autonomous, was always from both sides, right? It was always even shrouded by a degree of ambiguity that was not a display of lesser power, but on the contrary, it highlighted how effervescent, especially at this point, the potential of these authorities really was, right? In spite of all the deals, again, brokered between papacy and empires, the matter of, who actually does rule in the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, right? How far does papal control go? Even just from a temporal, banally geographical point of view. This was a fundamentally unresolved matter. We've seen even in the recent video about Joseph I at the beginning of the 18th century, how Holy Roman Emperor by that point we are after Westphalen, we are after the sort of much of what had characterized the plenitude of the imperial Catholic tradition, at least across Europe. You still have these contentions, like the imperial occupation of Comacchio, the threat of march on Rome at Semilia. We also perhaps underestimate how important the Latin Germanic syncresis was in calibrating this relation between papacy and empire, right? The Franks, but this could be extended also to the Longobards, to the Anglo-Saxons. And there is much, in fact, of, for example, today's common law that spiritually and institutionally lives, right, in the offspring of England, so to say, but also about the Bavarians, and to a degree other peoples around as well. But the fact that this was particularly different from, for example, the Byzantine Empire, from the Islamic world in great part, namely that the hypostatization of a statalistic rule was here fundamentally denied. It's not like Charlemagne or Louis the Pius, this great enlightened rulers, or better, those who had the luck, so to say, to survive all their brothers, and so to rule as unitary monarchs of the Franks in their empires over other peoples, tried everything possible to transfer the Roman statal administrative model north of the Alps, right? And this model was surely in place in places like the same Rome with the church. And we're talking a massive cultural legacy, something that really worked legally, even artistically, right? It's not merely, it's probably an outlook on the world. But even in Rome, this, in a Western sense, this is something you can appreciate already as far as the Latin and the Greek world are concerned, was understood in a much looser and liberty-based sense. Like the Franks were perhaps the apotheosis of this, especially combined with the degree of their the scale probably of their ecumenic rule. Namely, the idea that this was a society of leaders, right, of military clienteles. We know this very well, how the Frankish system worked. And therefore, the emperor, the king, was not really owing its subjects the stability of some superstructure or administrative mechanism per se. There was more than that than we normally think, right? This was also a broader world of Roman legacy that gets, as we've seen here, reactivated. But fundamentally, the idea, just like in a Tacitian description of the Germans, not far from that, at least, in spite of all changes that had occurred socioculturally in the Frankish world, was based on a deep respect of the individual liberty of, naturally, the noblemen, the aristocrats, the knights, so those who had actually earned from a social and personal point of view that liberty, and that could use it, was essentially a part of imperium, and that therefore kings and emperors were owed their power to the traditional fulfillment of their medium function with the divinity by bestowing that same power from heaven under their providential capacity. So not binding their subjects as serfs, as slaves, but having these warriors, these freemen, and gradually, increasingly, these aristocrats that were surely bringing down other people, and the freemen take a hit in all this. But also because there is an exhaustion, because of our expansion, there are other peoples invading from the other side down the line. And in this sense, owing their power to their own virtue that would naturally, instinctively bring the knights under that great godfather, right? That true hypostasis of God rather than of a state, of a merely earthly model rule. And so the idea of medieval aristocracy and nobility and chivalry and all the esoterics of it, all the what was living still freshly through the Indo-European legacy of the previous millennia across Europe in this newly calibrated world after the exhaustion of the greater Roman Empire. So a time that was surely less free than it had been before, but was also more aware, or was self-aware of this change. The actual potential is turned into actual practice, right? The West is restored, the imperial papal dichotomy is fully reaffirmed, and in fact, it's not even after the dissolution of the Carolingian Empire that this dichotomy dilutes itself, evaporates. On the contrary, it's continuously reaffirmed and continuously universalized to constitute the spiritual connective tissue of, and probably metaphysical connective tissue of post-Carolingian Europe itself, the one from which even the much greater medieval civilization at its peak during the 13th, the early 14th century will emerge, as we will see in this broader episode across the videos. Right? This is, again, incredibly relevant in a world that was really very materially poor, that really had, as we explained here, not much of any previous structure that had to simply reactivate the empire as such, and so successfully, right? You have veritable miracles. This is not just true for the Franks in their conversion back in the 5th century, skipping Arianism, embracing Catholicism, but also the Ottonians, right? The Saxons that had been the greatest opponents in more than just a military way to Carolingian conquest. They actually believed the same things, but they were just smaller in scale and capacity. And for that reason, they were more countercultural, more counter-ecumenic, but becoming themselves holy Roman emperors and fully embracing the metaphysical Romanity in their probably official genetic titles, right? They were literally thinking that their metaphysics made them Roman from a biological point of view. And this also was a sort of very deep question as well. It happened also through to renewed contact with the Byzantine Empire, because obviously the reactivation of Western Empire brings, again, with Italy and Rome, unavoidably to the reactivation of that contrast that had already, again, been envisaged in the same time of Clovis. I mean, the same Justinian later on had reconquered the central Western Mediterranean largely, say, obviously for all the benefits that would derive in terms of strict political, territorial advantages, the greatest spiritual one of ruling again over Rome directly and not through some sort of decentralized symmachoi, right? Even of Arian creed. But this massive, now at this point, elephant in the room, that was the Merovingian power, the reactivation of Frankish power towards the Mediterranean. It was probably an Atlantic perspective in which the Byzantines were reasoning in their 6th century reconquest. And eventually, sort of, the new pandemic arrived. The empire sort of exhausted itself. The Islamic invasions sever half of its territory. So the world shrinks dramatically. In many ways, we explain also the expansion of Islam through that lens. It wasn't much, something that could simply self-sustain itself as a big unitary power. It began to disaggregate as soon as it sort of reached its overstretch, right? And on basis, by the way, of different regional hubs that had largely been Roman. I mean, if you look at Syria, Egypt, Spain, what are we talking about, really? Tunisia. So this is recorded, by the way, all in a block, as you understood when I make this video. This is not even how I usually warm up, when I approach the topic, right? Because I want, say, to delineate a picture that we rarely insist on, or that we rarely visualize as such. Like, everybody knows this history, right? There are videos in which we descend into the sort of uncharted depths of historical research. So, for real, like, there are some certain topics that I research, and I'm the only person that I'm truly capable, at least, of bringing on the plate here. But the question here is also looking at the bigger topics that everybody knows, but that don't get, in fact, toyed with enough in our minds, right? What does Charlemagne's empire represent, right? If you search for this, obviously YouTube will show you those 20-minute Wikipedia summaries, whatever, made with AI at this point, with maybe some good visuals that I can, the visuals I provide you are okay, all right, but definitely there isn't much criticism there. Here we really go deep into the analysis as well. And so picture this, right? The coronation of Charlemagne introduced the organization of a new European ecumenic horizon between the Elbe and the Ebro, the English Channel, and Monte Cassino. To this ecumene corresponded a Christianity that soon separated from a Greek mold of some degree. This is interesting to think. Like, we rarely browse this because we always stress the differences, as we just did before, between the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean, right? We've seen in many different videos how the West, the Latin West, was organized very differently from the Greek East, right? Christianity had naturally spread from a Semitic background through a Greek language and had immediately also Latinized itself. Think about St. Paul's specific research for a militarized vocabulary for Christianity that could, in this sense, resonate with Roman, in this sense, probably Latin mentality. He was not searching for a Greek vocabulary, right? This also, in part, eventually is osmotically and sort of preconditionally spread there as well. But there is an interesting phase that is the one of late antiquity that usually the critics of Christianity, sometimes the detractors as well, wanted to represent this as some sort of non-European thing. Point out, namely, the idea that, in fact, the West, the salt, in some ways, it would have been replaced just by some overall Germanic identity, which is not true in the sense, at least, of proper ethno-linguistic case, right? If you look at Gaul, Spain, and Italy, I mean, this can't be made. It's an argument it can be made only on the grounds of juridical identity. At some point, it is true that, all the, you can say literally everybody who lived in any of these countries, because at some point there were the Byzantines controlling certain parts of that, but virtually, let's say, all Gauls, or at least all northern Gauls, became Franks, right? All Italians became Lombard, right? All Iberians became Goths by some degree. Again, with all exceptions, again, probably the Basques were not convinced of this. There were some pockets, let's say, of resistance even against these other Romano-Germanic powers. But in this sense, there is a point that I think I don't know how much this is discussed by other creators. At this point, I feel very isolated due to the fact that all searches at the end of the videos usually search if somebody has ever discussed this somewhere. Admittedly, YouTube does not help you finding it. But I may be at this point, and I'm surely am from in terms of scale of production, the only person talking about these aspects in a certain way and highlighting, in fact, this deep continuity of Romanity in the West. We mostly discuss this in relation with the concept of Byzantine, but there is, in fact, within a proper Romanity a difference. Nominal Romanity, so to say, that is the one that the Byzantines themselves somehow used to define, in fact, an empire at some point did stretch up to the entirety of Italy, especially before the Longobard arrives. A very sort of short amount of time overall. It's just a generation, right? But let's say, in this sense, indicating or describing, at least, this world within the Byzantine Empire as fundamentally homogeneous, which is obviously not true. It's not true at so many levels. We already pointed out how the deep connection between Gaul and Italy, this since time immemorable. If you go back to the bell beaker culture, if you look at sort of Celto-Italic continuity, historically things had changed very much, especially in Mediterranean, as you know. Lots of slaves, Levantine influences had arrived. And so there is indeed also in Italy this sense, especially along the coasts, along the, especially also the Hellenic-speaking still communities of coastal centers. This is typically Byzantine as a thing. Not just a similarity, but a commonality, right? The Italian interland had been changing, but it had also not been modified in its ethno-linguistic Italic stock. That's how the Longobards fundamentally eventually win over the Byzantines in the peninsula. Even after the end of their kingdom, at the hands of Charlemagne, you still have the southern duchies that are fundamentally opposing themselves to, successfully so, to Byzantine control. So it's a very decentralized situation. And there you have always that ambiguity, let's say, but, these places spoke Greek, whatever. Normally, the interland did not speak Greek. The majority of the population had always spoken, even at the peak of Magno-Grecian civilization, Italic languages. The interesting part of this, however, is that, in fact, we tend to Byzantinize these areas and to attribute even just to Rome that indeed had a lot of Greek influences, also Syrian. Well, think about the same evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. Think about, in fact, some prelates that arrived as far as from the Levant. This is something that continues, right? But the national mold of these countries is often sort of either discredited or saying, especially through a modern lens, but the modern nation, say of Italy or France or Spain or England, so did not quite exist as we fully understand. Naturally, there are different takes on how this would have been the case or perceived and so on, and there's fair arguments to be made about naturally the very gradual development of what we understand as a proper modern national identity. But it doesn't mean that it did not exist even unitarily before, right? There is no doubt, for example, that Italy had been a proper wall since at least the time of Augustus, or that Gaul maintained a very specifically sort of say inner horizon, even if we sort of look at the composite aspect of the north, the south, the Languedoc, the Languedoc, the Franks, the Burgundians, the Goths, etc. So composite identities are real, but they do not invalidate some deeper separation. This comes to be the case also as far as the spirit of the respective churches are concerned, right? You can argue that ever since Constantine had shifted the new sort of his own comitatus capital, so to say, to Byzantium, and so in this sense, in properly an Hellenic world, right, in a Hellenistically, unequivocally Hellenistic word, so to say, there had been a declaration of separation between the spheres of the northern Mediterranean, right? The Roman Senate remained there. The Roman Italic senatorial establishment remained there. Constantine creates something else on a different basis, one that would in fact allow that level of autocratization as opposed to a more feudal mentality among the Roman Italics. They surely preferred, and they were in fact the greatest opponents at some point of the Germanization of their own land. Constantinople to in fact peoples like the Goths, even though they were capable of a pretty peaceful and actually the most successful coexistence with the same Germans. Like in the consistorium of Ravenna, Theodoric sat with the Romans from one side and the Germans from the other, and so they were actually on the same level, right? Even though they had sort of different functions and prerogatives, but there was a proper civility. I also made a video about this. This is true also in the continuity of urban culture, for example. This is not a Greek world, right? This is something very different. And in spite of the distractions, or even perhaps even because of the distractions of the Gothic War, and especially the later Longobards conquest, it's ever clearer, with later also Carolingian conquest of Italy, that the West has properly a different moral background, that the papacy has successfully managed in the meanwhile to fully autonomize itself from Constantinople, that it remains a point of reference. It's not until the 12th century that the papacy really breaks with Constantinople, also because in 1204 the empire is destroyed by the same crusaders. But that separation, that idea that in fact imperial power must be checked, right, and balanced by a spiritual authority that has, however, also a degree of temporal one, such as the patrimony of St. Peter, radically distinguishes Rome. That is Rome, right? Constantinople is not Rome, right? Nobody ever dreamed, not even the Byzantines, to claim that the primate of charity, that the superiority of the Holy See, that there was something about the authority, the charisma of the Roman Pope that surpassed any other ecclesiastical authority. This, well, even before the papal monarchy, this even at the time which the Ecumenic Council was in theory supposed to in fact go over the same Roman papal decisions, which never fully happened, also because in part these ecumenic councils had tended to regionalize, and in that sense also to issue incredibly sort of heterodox ideas at best, as it happened for a very long time in the East. Think about all the monophysitism, monothelitism. There are so many different schisms with Rome. Right, and interestingly enough, Rome was being backed by, at some point, still Arian, so they're not even Catholic yet, Germanic powers against Constantinople, in a time, by the way, in which there was not yet a capacity to fundamentally invade one another. There was friction between the Longobards and the Byzantines in Italy, but in general, like there was a unanimous support towards a specific orthodoxy that Rome and not Constantinople incarnated. Like if you look at the iconoclasm, if you look at all the reasons that brought the Byzantines to so understandably try to save the savable in certain circumstances that, however, still fail in the end, as far as especially in fact as the losses of the Levantine provinces is concerned. Well, there you realize that there is an abyss, that well before Photius, that well before the Great Schism, there was definitely a cultural, spiritual, ethnic, political temper between the East and the West, right? In the arrival of Charlemagne, and by the way, we've seen in some videos that Byzantine chroniclers identify the age of Charlemagne, of Louis the Pious, as probably the moment in which they conceptualized that Rome was lost to them, right? Admittedly, the Byzantines had not been in Rome for quite a long time, like the 7th century, basically. They had attemptedly sent some exarchs from Ravenna to sort of take out the Pope. In some cases, they had also deported him, and he died in prison. This happened, especially in the earlier days. But at some point, the same Longobards defended the Pope against these attempts. There are very interesting situations. The Battle of the Salarian Bridge in Rome, for example. And in any case, in a very provincialized dimension, because it's not like the emperor was arriving with his own army to Italy. It was just like the exarch that was de facto an Italian ruler of some sort. And often, and sometimes even probably disobeying, right? A bit like the hunter in Snow White, like having scruples about that crime. It's undeniable that the affirmation of the Franks in Rome is the fuller and for good kind of affirmation also of a different Western imperial spirituality and metaphysical pursuit or canalization of that same theology, or in fact, orthodox thought. People don't. I still discover that people do not know what Catholic or Orthodox means, because it seems to me that how people think of these terms are the modern confessional definitions. Right? They have no clue about the actual theology behind these terms and what it meant also in official titling of the churches at the time. This is actually the case, especially Orthodox should be understandable to everybody in plain language, whereas Catholic may be sort of slightly more confusing. But aside from Schwerpunkt's meme, do you know what Catholicism actually means? That's the point. Do you actually know what Catholicism means? Because it's not really a matter of opinion. The further Romanization of the West in this path is quite fascinating, because admittedly, we give for granted that a Western Roman Empire would be revived. Many people do not even acknowledge this because they think, again, the Holy Roman Empire is something else. We pray for their souls, so to say, because it's not a joke. Right here, I'm being playful, but we must be extremely correct about this. I don't need to bring up my credentials, because I don't believe that if you claim that you are who you are, that you have some titles, it's properly the point. But I can't, at this point, after 2,800 videos, and to explain a bit what I do over the years, I simply, during an examination, I would not let you pass if you claim that the Holy Roman Empire was fundamentally not understood in the era as the actual Roman Empire, right? There is a discussion, as we will see now. That's why I started this other theme, as we will see now. But, and I actually hardly have the chance during examinations to sort of to address this specific topic, or at least to simply reject like the poor student in that circumstance. But in a serious, sort of higher kind of historiographical criticism and theological analysis, because that's what really matters here. If you look at ecclesiology, if you look at how nothing else had in fact even been stated against that, most of the, again, terminology we use tends to be heavily rigged by probably a modern interpretation of saying that was historically an anti-clerical one. Let's be honest about it. I would say even atheistic, probably in the contemporary era. But most of our history, the history that we study, is historiographically framed in the 19th century. All right, it starts at that point in moments and times where, for example, the national paradigm was deeply hostile towards properly imperial, and in a sense, sort of previously imperial authorities. The paradox, or at least what we should not give for granted, is the fact that, in fact, a true Roman Empire could be revived in the West. Ex post, we know that obviously Europe was evangelized, that say it would have not been realistically possible for this system to not to come under the idea of the existence, at least, of a universal authority, and especially a Catholically meant one. All right, there would have not been a restoration of so-called paganism or heathenism, however you prefer to miss the mark of what those beliefs actually were, that were in fact largely Catholic already, and some even did not exist with this terminology. But this is exactly the point. The general decline of universal authorities that we are actually witnessing even during the Middle Ages, regardless of the ups and downs. Overall, there is a great effort. There are two empires. There are other players that have stepped into the scene. So this is not the Roman Empire, right? This is not as unitary as in the past. However, you would think like there could be some simple rejection of Romanity, some simple rejection of the empire, some simple rejection of Christianity, right? And so it's not like we would give for granted, we would be wrong in giving for granted the fact that, of course, Europe would have been Christianized, civilized, developed further, and so on, stabilized towards an ever more unitary framework, because whether you like it or not, even through sort of the reinforcement of different national hubs that the same church contributed to establish, Europe became stronger and traumatically homogeneous, right, compared to other parts of the world, while still being different in its elements. So homogeneous by power, which is also what interests the imperial Catholic theology fundamentally. But you see that Romanity was properly recovered by also those, and properly imperial authority was recovered by those who could have simply done without it. There could have been a simple royal affirmation without the need to posit themselves under some greater universal authority. And this happens especially from a temporal point of view. I mean, I don't know, Bohemia gets into the whole Roman Empire proper. The whole Roman Empire remained limited. It does not extend to Poland, does not extend to Hungary. You can argue that, yes, the whole Roman Empire is something fundamentally quote-unquote German at this point. There were actually non-German parts of the same, evidently enough, between Italian, Slavic, French speakers, etc. But aside from that, there is a consensus across Europe that not just the emperor is meant to exist and to be the ultimate, in fact, temporal authority, but that spiritually speaking, there is only one pneuma, there is only one logos, there is only one heart, and this is obviously the holy city of Rome. I mean, not even heretics went as far as saying during the Middle Ages that Rome was not the center of Christianity. Or if it happened, this was a fringe within the same heretics, right? If anything, there was an emulation of Rome as well, but most popularistic evangelical movements wanted just reform in Rome, not because they thought that Rome was to be, in this sense, denied. This is, if you have never really thought of this, it's because likely you have been influenced by sort of anti-papism, by some modernistic Protestant kind of vibe, and it has unfortunately largely rigged our understanding of the Middle Ages when we come to sort of popular awareness of these topics and what Christianity represented, right? If you believe that the Middle Ages was a pool of darkness, of obscurantism, that the church repressed people, that hampered growth, I mean, you literally do not know the basics. This is not even the history of ecclesiology. This is the history of law. This is the history of state building, of administration, of art, of literacy. Like here, everybody understood. I mean, a Charlemagne understood that. A Charlemagne wanted a sitting stone with baths north of the Alps, right? Wanted to transfer like literacy he successfully with Benedict of Anian under Louis the Pius, a reform probably the European monasticism. There was an intense universalization of knowledge, of power, collective organization of this spiritual effort in favor of those who held this war. I mean, this is notorious. This is one of the most vibrating and fundamental sort of elements constituting medieval historiographical awareness today. It's not a matter of personal opinion. This is just like normally a divide between people that do not know that this thing even exists and actual historians that know that this exists. And it's difficult, again, to explain something like crusades to people who think that, I don't know, crusades are inherently bad, even from some sort of non-religious background. So you don't have to be an Islamist to believe that, like as not even an atheist, but just somebody who said, but I heard that war is bad, like this kind of things, right? But nobody has a problem, obviously, with the Romans conquering the Levant at some point. Never heard, frankly. But aside from populism and mental feebleness, the main issue seems probably from the lack of realization that the legacy of Rome, as the still existing, in fact, Roman Empire across the early and high Middle Ages, and also you cannot count the Byzantine Empire alone as having done that to a degree, but obviously as historians we take into account what was happening in the West and how those Germans maintained a very strong need of delegation reception of imperial titles from the ultimate Roman authority and eventually from the papacy. In fact, were always present. There is an imperial tradition in Britain, as you very well know, like the Bretwalda that at some point brings some Anglo-Saxon rulers to even adopt the title, not even of Imperator, but Basileus, interestingly enough. And there are different explanations. I'm not saying that was sort of a uniform title, that, again, that Romanity was, other than in an ecclesiastical sense, like a priority of Anglo-Saxon secular rulers just per se. But the idea of empire and the necessity of reintegrating what was seen in a global power was deeply there. The same goes for Spain, that has actually a pretty explicit imperial tradition as well, that as such is so ecumenic that in fact it entails like what will remain actually for all rulers out there, like the figures like Alfonso VI positing themselves as the protector not just of the Christians but of the Jews and of the Muslims, of the Mudayyars that lived in the Iberian Peninsula. And if you don't understand that either, in parallel with the existence, obviously, of holy war, and in this sense, like wars between Christianity and Islam, etc. Well, unfortunately, it means that you don't understand how the double-threaded mechanism of this worked, right? What being a universal ruler entailed, as opposed to be part of seeing this as some part factionalism of some sort. For example, Dante, when writing about Muhammad, he described him as not just placing him in hell, but in sort of with quite injurious terms, but really indicating him as a schismatic bishop. And not because Dante did not know what Islam was, because you find some idiot that thinks that, like at this point, like this guy kind of didn't actually know, because you see in the Middle Ages, people were weird and ignorant and made up stuff. They perfectly knew what Islam was. The problem, and also this is the case if you have an idea of Dante's the level of literacy, what kind of masters he had, where they had traveled. By the way, if you speak properly of Islamic influence, but because obviously the Catholic ecumenic reality could not contemplate in the plenitude of the Christian religion as probably the correct way to the divinity, but some deviations from the same universal path, so that other quote-unquote religions were nothing but some sort of aberration, some accident, some misunderstanding. This actually makes a lot of sense from a theological standpoint. And remember, in all of this, again, what we said before regarding theosis, incarnation, and the Trinity. Because this stuff cannot be made up. This is fundamental in the so-called religions of the book as a radical difference, right? With Christianity being the only one to uphold these three altogether, and the others not doing that, right? And there is a reason, if this is also the case, for the, in this sense, spiritual precondition of medieval civilization to boom in the way it did. I say precondition because this wasn't evenly just about Christianity, it was also about what existed before. And I think that studying the Western history ultimately brings to the coherent recognition of this dynamic. It's not much a theory. It's the fundamentals of the same religions we're discussing and the ones that also preceded this in Europe, and the same goes for the understanding of the empire and the role of it in its priestly element that had, again, basically seceded in terms of temporal, spiritual with the empire and the papacy in the Middle Ages, but were in late antiquity. But that had been, in a historical sense, obviously in Christianity since inception, as they were still, however, seen to be unitary. Right. So at times I discovered that people have difficulty in understanding the fact that in medieval thought, there is a corporative hierarchy where different elements, unequal elements, are meant to be part of a complete whole that becomes fully functional and so capable of divine transfiguration only in the moment in which they're correctly posited within this hierarchy. So if people still think that even in the later struggle, for example, between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, there was just one guy who believed one doctrine and one believed another, you're reasoning as a modern person. You literally do not get what that whole thing was about. And that's why I'm also making these videos. But that you understand why I have to go step by step as well. This is also, I think, what we should recover. I don't want to digress on sort of the explanation of the imperium and temporal power manifestation as a direct mirror of the spiritual one, because this is also a very Catholic concept, even in strictly confessional terms. And obviously, in a world where people have deep distrust towards institutions, but also they have no perspective every time you point this out, creates like a really big puzzle for them. When we look at the Middle Ages, in any case, I was just saying as far as historiography is concerned, when we look at the hierarchical ordinances of the Roman Church, within, we can say within the Holy Roman Empire, because again, the Church, the Patrimonium, did not belong to any earthly power by definition, right? But and so that was a bit of a nuance in that to express how still, however, functionally separated, as you understand now, the relation between papacy and empire really was, but pertaining, as we explained, now to a fully Western dimension, and or being more loyal to that as opposed to the rest of Christianity that, again, we tend to understand in schismatic terms, and that we should not truly understand in strictly confessional ones. Like, it's obvious that Western and Eastern rites had already started to drift apart. It's kind of obvious that different churches would have different traditions and so on. But of course, there is a greater proximity between Catholicism and Orthodoxy in the way we understand them today than there is with the Protestant churches to begin with. So for not talking about some, different attitudes that exist today towards Christianity, within the same Christianity, which are naturally not even worth being discussed. But the development of canon law, the Decretum Gratiani, that if you don't know what it is, I'm a bit sorry for, because if you don't know that, but what do you study the Middle Ages for? I mean, seriously. But this power concentration of the papal monarchy, right? This is all actually pretty Augustan vestige of imperial Romanity, that in this Roman element, and that's why we're talking about here, Romanization and Germanization, Latin Germanic, Romano-Germanic, was at the same time Germanized, in part literally in its human substance, by incorporating warrior ethos, feudal values, and monastic missionary zeal. This is, again, incredibly relevant in a probably dichotomic sense, in this functional hierarchy, and exemplified, for example, by that level of episcopal warlikeness that existed pretty much all across Western Europe specifically. Right, I'm pretty sure that warrior bishops existed also in other contexts, but historically, like we have such a homogeneous or homogeneous, if you prefer me to say that, and easily documentable level of warrior bishops, that it's a bit difficult there to unsee what the Latin Church was really about. For not talking about the monastic military orders that, again, find an equivalent in broader universal tradition, also in other religions, not just other parts of the Christian world, but are also fundamentally unique in the way they're structured and framed within, in fact, a coherent wall. Right? This is quite interesting. Islam, in all its fragmentation, is greater than the one of Christianity, and especially from a spiritual standpoint, does not have an overarching authority on earth. There is a sort of pretty competitive attitude in ways that in fact tend to surely speak to a specific interpretation of Islam from their point of view. Think of how, I don't know, Egypt at some point was taken over by the Shias during the Fatimid era, then eventually sort of passes back to Sunnism. In the West, you don't really have any of this. You have heretical currents, but there is the deep, again, thanks also to Theosis, the Trinity and Incarnation, the idea that rulers are sacred, rulers are divine, right? Islam has this negative bias towards temporal authority where everybody is a sort of an usurper and aware another of God's power. This is it would even be theologically correct if you understand, of course, original sin, etc. But the way this takes eventual substance in Islam, aside from the various differences, there is not priesthood, there is this overconfidence about the fact that secular rulers can make up for that sort of dual lack of dual powers, as a matter of fact, that had already characterized the Common Era. And Malik, for example, is the equivalent of king, is heavily loaded in negative exceptions in Arabic, whereas in Latin, Rex, this is something, it's both Christ and to secular rule, because in the Catholic world, rulers are sacred and are closer to God in terms probably of metaphysical transfiguration. As active protagonists of that, right, as opposed to just something that is received out of God's mercy in Islamic tradition. God's mercy or simple will without any clear understanding. Decision without an active victory of transfiguration in mankind, right? You understand how radical the divide really is. So it's impossible not to see how the Romano-Germanic syncresis was truly unique in its own kind. I would add in this also the Slavs. I mean, any people that to a degree understood this. This was understood by degrees, of course, also in the Byzantine world, etc. But the peak of medieval civilization is Western civilization. And this comes to incorporate also other peoples that also escape, in some cases, the former Byzantine influence. Think about what happened in Moravia that was fairly contested. There are some Slavs, obviously, that remain closer to the Byzantine Empire, actually the least developed ones, whereas the others are bringing their own Catholic understanding of sacred rule and rulers into the table, and it's really sometimes even something more primitively immediate, regardless in that case of the shortcoming of power. We've seen this in the video about Ottokar II and his attempt at hegemonizing Central Europe and the Baltic, including the Teutonic Order during the Great Interregnum, and his view of leadership from something that looked at least that echoed still a more tribal way of the older times, as opposed to, I don't know, Rudolf of Habsburg that was already fundamentally feudal, Roman. Roman equates German in their language at the time, and in this sense already sort of coming probably from a different, admittedly also more developed and integral view of imperial authority. There are also, and I hope to cover this in many other videos, many instances of Ghibelline, aside from the investiture controversies as such in the West, attitudes, but even in relatively inconsequential ones, such as, I don't know, the Polish king mocking the German one allegedly in some diplomatic sea because he said the latter had to respond to the Pope, whereas the Polish king would have been allegedly on his own, which also technically wasn't really what it was, right? Or if it was the case, with greater autonomy, also because Poland played less of a role compared to the German king overall. And aside from that, it sounds like these people did not have a great power on their own, right? And now that I think about it, this is really notorious. What you hear on, like, when we speak about medieval civilization in general, there is still this modernistic and secularistic bias that even when successfully acknowledging the well historiographically established understanding that medieval civilization was an explosion of power, right, of moral force, of art, of literacy, of technical development, right, of art of war accomplishment and so on. And regardless of the different degree by which normally, I say it as a military historian, these respective elements are historiographically recognized. I'm contributing especially to the latter one, as you understand, with my publishing. Some of you may have already read me and not really know that. But aside from that, the attitude is fundamentally still sort of materialistic / scientific narrowly meant, right? When you say the greatness of medieval civilization, what is it? Normally, I don't know, the Hellenization through continual transfusions of Aristotelianism via translations from Arabic and Greek in centers like Toledo. That's fundamentally a very important moment, obviously, in especially Western revival in the 12th and the 13th century, before you have a dominant Neoplatonism through figures like the Pseudo-Dionysius and the Erugena. However, the emphasis is normally placed on some sort of derivative injection. Like, it's not like when you're told about this revival, it's fundamentally about, this was philosophy, these translations were quite important, but there is a context that allows this stuff to be reabsorbed from the classical past. It's more like, the translations from Greek, Arabic, Jewish, etc. were all, it took, like, at some point, these people didn't have, say, it's not like literally this was claimed, or literacy or manuscripts or whatever, but let's say the notions that it's this level of literature and philosophical sort of expense that makes Europe the way it is, as opposed to, and we know this very well, so from a technical point of view, a scientific point of view, that the reason why this was happening was not some sort of injection from some, the Islamic world or the Byzantine world we're living in, literary or scientific opulence. And the West didn't have anything. At some point, they look at these books like Parmenides, they sniffed it or whatever, and they started sort of building cathedrals and sort of taking over parts of the Mediterranean. No, the way this actually happened was through actually a greater spread of literacy, right, in Western Europe, and especially in the countries that alone were competitive with, for example, the Byzantine one, as we also made some specific videos of explaining in terms of per capita wealth, of general population, and overall power, that was just a fraction of the West, not even the rest of Europe. And when we see this, we're talking obviously Gaul and Italy, but this is obvious, right? But this system is expanding, and this place is so literate, but also so proactive, so entrepreneurial, so affluent, so in this sense already capable and educated, that these books did not arrive in the West by chance. They were actually searched for by Western. We know their names, right? We know if you study the various travels, for example, to Spain, but not only, like also to the Byzantine Empire, the Levant during the Crusade, realize that there was a very specifically targeted interest for works that the Westerners, first of all, already know they existed, and that the Easterners weren't actually using to the extent that already the Westerners were using. At this point, the most updated historiography, which is also so from decades, but it's not really something new, from generations, we could even say, were necessary to give a theoretical framework for manualistic and didactic purposes for a level of technological, literary development. Again, see what the Decretum Gratiani is, see what the recovery of Roman law is. That is paradigmatic. Roman law was not reapplied with the level of sophistication and expanse and development by the Byzantines at this point in the way the Bolognese Studium and the Holy Roman Empire was doing, right? And to eventually become the common law of most of Europe from the later Middle Ages onwards, from this massive tradition that had juridically surpassed by, in terms of systematic legal exercise, whatever happened in the much more socially sclerotic Byzantine culture. These Westerners went properly to pick those manuscripts because they were already aware of the places where these were contained, right? This is a divide that very few people kind of realize, namely the fact that since Roman times, actually, and if you are versed in history of literature, history of codicology, paleography, you kind of know this, that the actual places in which books were read in antiquity, literally read as we intend reading, regardless of the collapse of reading in the last decade or so, was not the East, was not the Greek, sort of this Hellenistically overly sophisticated world, whatever. It was actually the West. Right, the place where people sat down, and often, admittedly, it's not like they read individually. This started actually with Christianity the most as a religion of the book, but where people sat down and heard what was being read properly. This happened in Western libraries, where specifically described this, and the East witnessed instead just basically major warehouses full of manuscripts accessed every once in a while by some court literates that were to research mostly some philological aspects when we talk about science and the idea that the ancient world had the scientific revolution was thwarted either by the terrible Roman conquests or whatever, or by the terrible Christianity, depending on how, what kind of person you're talking to. Actually shows that the greater attitude to individual reading occurred in the West as opposed to the East. It's not like in the East they weren't literate or that didn't make use of that, but we understand that in terms of literary, scientific, philosophical production, the West, also in the early Middle Ages, was much more sort of widespreadly literate to the extent to which different centers were active, independent of some overarching structure that somehow informed, like in the Byzantine Empire, some styles and some sclerotic canon that you can immediately start seeing kicking in from late antiquity onward, right? If you have an idea of Byzantine history through the sources, you know that at some point you don't have insightful scholars like they had historians that they had happening in the past, including in the Latin world. I mean, think about Tacitus. Think about even how a Caesar was writing for Romans. They normally weren't so literally inclined in terms of actual production like the Greeks, but could write ad hoc, proving that he was capable of like the masterpieces that we know of, including also other parts of literature that unfortunately were lost, that it was author of. And as such, like think about panegyrics, how history changes. Like you don't understand anymore. Like the word histories before, it's not, histories keep existing, but they sound much more like, have you read Procopius? Like courtly gossip, with even a black legend, like for which you have a Procopius or Pseudo-Procopius that eventually seems to first magnifies Justinian as the perfect prince, which is typically in communistic literature, and then starts talking bad about him behind the scenes of whoever had written that. And you don't understand whether these people are schizophrenic or not, but you would fail understanding that literature if you don't know in which context, in fact, they were produced. Not some scattered centers of learning, but some very narrow, restricted, elite courtly environments, right? This actually continues, right? The Islamic world in itself does not seem to have had this more policy. Very, very important in this is urban life. You can't say by the high Middle Ages that Eastern urban life was more thriving than the Western one from a cultural point of view, from a literary point of view, from a scientific point of view. All right, bigger cities does not mean more organically developed or functional cultural capacity as such, right? And they weren't even that big. I mean, Constantinople was huge, but if you look at other towns in the empire, weren't, right? And the Westerners had actually, in that sense, as a sum, the bigger cities, the bigger urban life, and in this sense, also enormous literary production. This is not just a matter of preservation, right? Even if it was a preservation, because things happened, like the Byzantine Empire fell at some point. Baghdad was destroyed by the Mongols. This was tragedies, right? There's nothing to feel glad about. This, brought about some traumatic loss for the entire world that the same West resents of still today. But to ignore that the same way in which we preserved history since antiquity, since Hellenic historiography, for example. The paradox is also more modern and secular, but still is an expression of a culture. It was able still, like in a slightly less quote-unquote democratic sense, like Alexander's feudal monarchy, to take over the entire Achaemenid Empire, right? It's of the known world, and or Rome that managed in this sense to reform a liberal empire compared to, in terms of individual personal autonomy, compared to other autocratic forces like China. Look at India. Like there wasn't the same level of liberty among those countries as in the West, as there wasn't, in fact, the same spiritual legacy as a consequence that could be collected from that in the Middle Ages. Right? This is very interesting because we should make at some point some videos comparing how in medieval times, compared from antiquity, for example, the Chinese imperial ideology changed because they had the same level of fracture with antiquity, but also same level of re-edition of the same concept, and this with already progressed differences between the two cultures at all points. So this is a universal mechanism, and how medieval civilizations respond to that is also quite relevant in and of itself, right? So don't be fooled merely by a secular and modern bias that only talks to you about scientism as opposed to actual science, right? Never, in the sense, look down to the Middle Ages because you've been told that it was a moment of stagnation as opposed to growth. As a matter of fact, medieval civilization is largely comparable in scale with the ancient one. In some aspects, it was actually more advanced. In some aspects, was less advanced, but also there's a different context for that. So that obviously civilizations are basically capable of doing the same things. Tend to reflect it, even when they have a different balance from one side and the other. And here we open a quite relevant parentheses. I'm not really sure because the video is fairly long the way it is, and I'm not sure that we can simply sort of open this parenthesis in a thematically profitable sense, rather. Even though we're going to embrace still a pretty big picture. So again, I'll see how to handle it. But I was touching on some aspects of sort of literature and philosophy because, as you know, not just we can understand the metaphysics of Christianity and of this great imperial Catholic tradition of medieval civilization through them, or at least this would facilitate the task, given that in any case the same medievals were basing themselves on the work of the ancients. But because, notoriously, in the figurative arts, and through the figurative arts as well, we can appreciate this in ways that are, I would say, self-revealing, especially if you have a Platonic idea of aesthetics, even though the Aristotelian part works as well. This was the initial theme of my, also the previous video. In fact, you see in the thumbnail that one had was actually the statue of Synagoga in the Bamberger dome. I also made a video about the Bamberger Reiter for that matter, and passed with an AI realistic filter for showing you what she would really like in that expression. And so it's not really a history of art video per se, but now when I think about it, we will be talking a lot about this as well, right? The figurative arts, those in which an immediate feeling of the world finds expression, in fact, render plastically visible this new reality. Romanesque Gothic architecture represented a fracture with the basilical art of mosaics and domes through the adoption of rounded, then pointed arches, ribbed vaults, flying buttresses, and vertical emphasis reaching toward the divine in structures like Chartres or Notre Dame. This new art, and I still shall make proper videos about the metaphysics of Gothic in particular. Romanesque architecture was, especially in the earlier part of the Middle Ages, still reflecting some moral abatement from the fall of the empire, this idea that look at what you've done, right? Look at hell and what awaits to you. Like the walls were not fundamentally meant to reflect, they were meant to barely show, like truly with it at the light of flame, these monstrous figures that were reminding the plebs what kind of terrible consequence occurs for original sin and what eventually the fear that had brought down the same imperial Catholic empire. Gothic architecture owes much of its theology, in fact, not to some materialistic or technologistic background, like Vitruvius did not influence the birth of Gothic architecture as much as Augustine's De Musica and its Neoplatonic numerology that we've approached also in the Hermetic tradition provided. The idea, as you know, in Gothic art is that not just there is a quest for heaven, right, reaching for the sky, but internally, externally, you have the idea, obviously, that the cathedral is the symbol of the world, of the outer world, the superficial one, right? The cathedral itself is the big symbol to be deciphered. And outside of that, you find all these monstrosities of the world that were meant to terrify, a bit like the four diastators in the saint they had done before. Think about the gargoyles, think about the idea that, it's actually a more refined idea that we have to be able to understand also the errors in the world and the horrors of the world as the consequence of a specific fault that we actively that we constantly enact for us to be mortal to begin with. The only reason why we're mortal is the fear of death itself, right? And when you enter our beautiful Gothic cathedrals, you know that aside from how, of course, this style spread far and wide in later history, in great homage to the original, there is a metaphysics of light, right? The idea that walls are white, porous, reflecting, in this sense also elongated with sort of scarcity of massive blocks, pillars that must be in this sense modulated, sculpted in ways that reflect some more geometrically departing, right? Asymptotic trajectory vector is all one with the notion that the walls themselves do not exist, right? The reason why Gothic cathedrals are so well illuminated inside is exactly the fact that the stone, the way it is specifically worked, must reflect light, must ignite the space of Holy Ghost, right? And that the sense through and through, in fact, the horrors of the world itself. It's not something that merely sort of achieves heaven, but it's the greatest attempt to come closer to it. And so you have to be always aware of this contrast between light and darkness within the system, and appreciating really with this glimpse, like imagine that we have this beautiful rays coming in, breaking like a cloud, the stormy day, like the plenitude of the space, the fact that even if you can see only a part of it, you can grasp how it's part of a broader structure that is essentially the universal one, that is the once properly achieved, makes you, elevates you to the mystery of, and to the partaking of God itself, right? I could digress, but let's say that in part also later Romanesque art has this, like there is an evolution from that. There is actually an important departure. They're two very different styles, but you can perceive in these structures architecturally the effort, right? The various stages of this development historically. In the same manner, Romanesque and Gothic sculpture projected new spiritual models emphasizing realism, emotion, and narrative. You have the absolute awareness that these are not fundamentally bent to some simple naturalism or contemplational pathos of some sort. They are meant to illustrate incarnation and divine transfiguration at the same time, right? They are confident models of mankind, right? They're transfigured bodies, they're sublimated souls and flesh. They live, right? They see, they interact with you, they express the plenitude of divine power. And as they are part of a collective world, they symbolize, as individual statues, a community, right? So not merely the church as such, but the completion of the universe through imperial, in fact, an ecclesiastical power that is inherent in potential among all of us, right? We've seen how in Indo-European theology there's this distinct sense that you can arrive through love. And so the same passion that we were saying before distinguished the hematophilic Franks in the affirmation of a sacred race that could rise to heaven. The conquest in the process, in fact, of the entire world, right? That's what the cathedral symbolizes. This is what Gothic art shows. Every element is part of a wall, right? Once medieval sculpture overcame its first uncertain attempts, still influenced by Byzantine art with its stylized hieratic forms, it created a poem in honor of the human body. If you look at late antique art, which is beautiful, the same Byzantine art is beautiful, but you find something that is increasingly encrusted, maybe in beautiful sort of colors reflecting gold and purple and probably jewels in this precious material. But just like books had started to be represented in this very art in late antiquity as distant from the reader and closed as opposed to the open ones in the past, that art had been involutive, had been sclerotizing an iconism that, while seeking first the objective of a deep contemplative fixation, also detached the viewer from the idea of actionable divinity, right? This was more like a gateway to a higher dimension that, however, was kept closed behind these beautiful, austere mosaics. As you know, the same human forms had in late antiquity. If you in school, every history of art books tells you this, that have sort of pathized and sort of sort of shrunk almost like mankind as such. Bodily proportions become less natural. You have a greater emotional pursuit in the depth of the soul as opposed to the action outside, like through the body. You have bigger eyes, for example. And you have, in general, more stylized figures. You have the fixation of an old standard. That's why you find in Byzantine art the classicizing forms, right, and designs that remain eventually in the rest of Byzantine history. As if, I don't know, a Byzantine soldier of the 13th century, we talked about this also in the historical military unit series, looked like, some idealized version of a late antique warrior saint, right? And in this sense, they had stopped. They had provided a very deep, compact meaning behind this. They had surely sublimated the introspective aspect of the world as decadence in the Fourth Age, and therefore also the rightful invitation of Christianity to realize how a more spiritually radical turn was required in order to invert the fall. But in this sense, it's as if somebody had fallen asleep and in his half slumber was not able to wake up again. What happens in Western Europe is something very, very different, right? And interestingly enough, this art became the object of hatred in other communistic iconoclastic moments in history. Despite a less warm and sunny climate that corrodes everything, and despite subsequent Huguenot iconoclasm during the 16th century wars of religion and Jacobin distractions in the French Revolution, examples survive of a humanity, or better, a mankind in the fullness of its powers, a truly transfigured humanity. The statues of Reims, the great Gothic cathedral in northern France, whose 13th century West facade gem sculptures feature smiling angels, naturalistic drapery folds, individualized facial expressions, and contrapposto-like poses, blending classical poise with Christian spirituality, stand equal to the Chori of Athens, with their slender, swift, elastic bodies, strong yet elegant bone structures, and subtly expressive faces that match the Hellenic faces of the archaic period, delineated before the rigid formation of canons, too rational and too exterior. This parallelism, I think, is striking. So Reims is, as you know, the place, the sea of the consecration of the Western Frankish kings. Right, when you look at the 13th century, you know that these places had truly transfigured in a divine fashion. France had de facto become the empire, and this had been done through the victory of Bouvines, where Philip II Augustus, that is called like that for a reason, is officiating the Mass before the eventually victorious battle that will destroy an excommunicated imperial rival, and that will take France literally to the stars, like a sacred dynasty, the one of the holy, of the anointed, right? Louis IX, as his descendant, winning the sanctity. So during the Age of Crusades, we have really to talk more about 13th century France and its exploit and these crucial figures, right? So it's unsurprising that the Huguenots, the Jacobins, would hate, right, these figures. You would have had some beautiful Gothic art also in the Netherlands, hadn't it been destroyed by Calvinist iconoclastic fury, right? Some of the greatest disasters in the history of mankind do not much have to do with loss of people, but with loss of art, right? That in many ways is much, if you understand the doctrine of the two natures, is in fact way more important than humanity for what they actually mean, not the stone in it, which is the reason, in fact, why in part the same great classical civilization had ended, like the loss, the willing loss of power to spiral down into an abyss, and that instead allows, in part through the resurgence from the abyss, this new renaissance in the 12th and the 13th century. And on the long wave, in fact, of a much sort of very portentous Latin Germanic, initially Chthonic rise, like the Latin Germanic institutional and political systems take a while before sort of catching up in terms of level of formal structure to surpass the others, but they do so with a power that is unprecedented in some parts of this world, including here the sort of northeastern France. We've seen also the same Rome, and everything that existed more or less in between had never really fallen behind the other artistic forms. Like I invite you to look at, for example, Byzantine art, and when you open a history of art book about medieval art, when you look at the Byzantine chapter, what do you look really? Yes, okay, there is Hagia Sophia, there are sort of many important sort of Eastern pieces of art, but fundamentally the greatest masterpieces are in Byzantine Italy. If you look at the Ravenna, if you look and this doesn't stop there. If you look at the beautiful ivories typical of the 10th, 11th century, continuing in the 12th, if you look starting at sort of Romanesque and Gothic structure, and even with the Byzantine influences up to the 13th century among Giotto, Cimabue, you realize, right, that the most lifelike, the most actually sophisticated and pneumatically powerful artistic expression takes place in the West, does not take place in the East, as a matter of fact. Italy is the cradle of this. Admittedly, there is also a reason if you talk about the Trecento, if you talk about the Renaissance and humanism, there's definitely a reason. But we look at also the great cathedrals of England, of France, and how these spread, by the way, pretty much everywhere in Germany, in Spain. There is also an Italian Gothic, as a matter of fact. And you appreciate, in fact, the utter splendor of this achievement. Can you really see anything like that in the world at the time? We don't actually have much like that. There are comparable level of developments of certain structures in other big regional hubs. If you look at Asia, there are different cradles with this. This is happening, all right? But they're not as unitarily complete. They're not. And this was a character of Romanity as well. The idea that Rome was successfully replicated pretty much across the entire West through colonization, through the christening of all the sacred hilltop, right, of the West as a Jovian mount, right? So the same capital and the same Olympus. These cathedrals are actually supposed to be that as well, as we've seen also. If you look at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, in the video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, that the battle cry, the Mount of Jupiter. And if you know what that means, if you connect it, especially with the video about the medieval German slumbering monarchs in the mountain, only then you will be able to realize how actually radically uniform Western civilization is at that point in history. It's something utterly insane, right? And all this, quite distinctively, in a quite distinctively European sense, stemming from countries that were different, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, environmentally. They all were, however, cohesively compact in a great imperial Catholic tradition. And this is something that you do not see in any other part of the world. There is nothing that comes even remotely closer or can fit the same mold of that. It's something completely different, right? It is in the vivacity of it, in the liberty of it, in the booming of feudal civilization in parallel with the communal one, right? You can argue that, I don't know, also China or India had an idea of universality. The same sort of different religions, the same. If you look at the Byzantine Empire, it can pass from an institutional standpoint. It's still always of religious mold, right? But the level of development of 80 cathedrals erected, by the way, in a record time, in a world that still, for some inexplicable reason, some people think to have been backwards, and that was, by the way, dominating the entirety of Western Eurasia at that point, because if you look at sort of trade routes, if you look at military power, etc., the entire Western Eurasia Mediterranean revolved around Western Europe. Like, there is no doubt whatsoever. It's just a massive civilization. It's an enormously concentrated amount of people, of wealth, and something utterly insane. At this point, by the 13th century, in that sense, the Byzantine and Islamic countries are, in comparison to Europe, at their lowest. Never mind that the Byzantines reconquer Constantinople at the point. Never mind that Jerusalem is lost, and eventually Acre too at the end of the century. We are at that point also towards a great stagnation of imperial civilization. It's a universal authority and so on, and so that you have the mid-14th century crisis. This, again, happens to everybody else. All right, the end of the Pax Mongolica, the birth of the Ancien regime as we know it. Actually, this is yet another massive crisis with the Black Death, largely also caused by the overexpansion of the exhaustion of resources of this great civilization. They made war continuously to compact further power. We know this well under the aegis of Frederick II, the dream of Western and Eastern reunification. That, by the way, the West went overwhelmingly close to, right? Unlike, I don't know, the Byzantine Empire or even less the Islamic world, right? Have you ever thought of this in perspective? Have you ever heard anyone making these remarks, or are we? Because to me, I didn't know these things when I went to university. Like, I had to become a doctor myself before researching this on my own and starting to reflect on it, as you've seen in my long Schwerpunkt history, to get to this point and this realization. The other crucial point being the parallelism between the sort of middle ground, sort of the result of tradition and innovation in that momentous time of history, like in fact the 13th century, the one of classical Hellas, right? And especially the former part, like the one in which, let's say, after the Dorian migrations that I made an entire video on before anybody says, but the Dorian migration is a discredited historiographical, watch my video. Brought to the refreshment of the political order through more widespread liberty. As a matter of fact, when we look at the polis, we immediately connected to some sort of democracy. Democracy is not a good term. It's incredibly misleading. Doesn't mean what it's supposed to mean. I support what today we call democracy, but it's because it's democracy is something else. Like we don't live under the dictatorship of the proletariat. There was a heavily traditional and aristocratic as well character to the classical polis. It was less aristocratic, less monarchic in particular, than it had been under the Mycenaeans, Mycenaeans if you prefer. And we'll talk about the era of history more. It was sort of the so-called Bronze Age collapse, regardless of how much you want to debate the terminology. I'm more interested in the history of it than definitions. But in this sense, this was not much a scaling down of the system from a successful one. On the contrary, like if the Mycenaean, the Bronze Age ended, in a sense, was ending, we can't sort of address these eras changing chronology in different ways, because the Bronze Age never quite ends in the way we intended. I mean, also at the time of Rome, if we speak to that there's a prevalence of the iron, both in a material and in a spiritual sense, but the bronze was still there, and again, sacred royalty was still there. If you look at the Spartan tradition, indeed, there is a much more, it's as if it had been like the Franks of the Greeks in that situation. They were truly less statally bound, and they invested more in their establishment superiority, quality, and this had some cons, but the pros are often downsized by the idea, again, that not just Sparta was not exceptional in and of itself, and by a degree it's not true, in fact, but because also the other polis had a big deal of aristocratic, in the sense, sacred leadership, and we tend to forget what happened when the Persians invaded, how many polis were sort of fine with their own quote-unquote tyrannies that were also of the great ecumenic empire at that time, the Achaemenid one, inspiration and support as well. And it's in that moment that the more geometric forms, the more primitive forms, or even lack of representation re-emerged with the synchrosis between the traditional and the innovative, right? The right balance between what, say, had we been talking about Rome, we would call the patricians and the plebeians. This is what makes in Rome, in fact, like the peak of itself at a point, like the imperial legions, the so-called republic and other misnomer expansion. Under Augustus, you have a more fully ecumenic and balanced system where you have there are many different strata that remain for centuries under the Principate asset. The great achievement, in fact, of the Golden Age under Augustus. And in these in-betweens, right here in the 13th century, like the great in-between the great classical empire and a new decline, that is not also full or in the same way the late Middle Ages, say the Renaissance, the early modern age, is actually a late medieval civilization. People do not understand this. It's not like there is an end of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages barely end in their fundamentals. What happened in the mid-14th century with the big crisis and the shrinking of the system that can't be denied is still the same exact social-cultural system that you find unchanged in Europe up until the French Revolution and the end of World War I, depending on which country you're looking at. And we decided to make it modernity in an anti-imperial, in an anti-Catholic, in an anti-traditional sense, just for telling you how messed up our understanding of the past really, really is. But aside from this, and this is about celebrating different aspects of a same dynamic, right? Without sort of taking the others in consideration, right? It's not like the French Revolution, in fact, did not happen. It had not happened before 1918, or that the American Revolution wasn't there either, and that meant something in the picture. But it's a process, right? This decline was happening since the fall, obviously enough. So you can always point to something that already did not work really. But the Gothic forms are, in this sense, this incredible blend between an incredibly if you want, materially blessed verse, sort of craftily advanced, technically really effervescent civilization of the one of the communes, that is also one of the third estates, of trade, of commerce, of the whole substance of the substratum, the fourth estate, the peasantry, agricultural development, specialized crops. You name them. You have a massive mercantile civilization, but also still the same imperial hierarchy in the forms also of these other various kingdoms that allowed also these other apparatus to develop, including the city-states, their armies that could counterbalance themselves together with the papacy, the same imperial force, and so on, that, however, is not separated from it. It informs, in a great hierarchical body, the entire system. That's what I was saying before. Never think that we're the Guelphs and the Ghibellines merely as some, okay, no, I want to destroy the empire, or I am the emperor who wants to maintain it. That's not how the system worked. At least in line of principle, you can argue that the extremes would have led toward that. But in actual fact, these were just people that were struggling to affirm their own respective temporal and spiritual capacity. I mean, bearing the cingulum militaris, or bearing arms as freemen, like, it's something that beat very hard in the hearts of, say, imperial knights from Germany at the service of Frederick Barbarossa, etc., and the free communes, right, of Lombard Italy, with their idea of, in the sense, freedom as nobility of citizens in arms that affirmed their own imperial power, that they thought, actually, through their own knightly leadership, to be competitive. And they didn't really think that. They proved that, to become competitive with imperial power itself, and therefore having themselves imperial power. Check out that video I made on Cremona, and especially the heraldry, the coat of arms of the city, what that globe, golden globe in the hand of a knight, by the way, Cremonese knight, really means, right? Because it sounds today like, I don't know, these were basically third estate systems that wanted to erode the aristocracy. We're not in the 18th century, right? This is half of a millennium before, if not more. And so this is something radically different and much more traditional. It's across this world, and there is a reason why before I mentioned France and Italy alike, because there you have, paradoxically, we've seen it in many videos about the Angevins, the actual Angevins, like the French ones, so to say. I mean, also the original were French, but I mean the Capetian ones that are more powerful and important in this sense, or at least considering their scarce coverage in pop culture compared to the Plantagenets of England, so to say, are the full proof of this. France and Italy are the most advanced parts of Western civilization, and they are yet fundamentally two very different systems, right? At least as far as what it pertains mostly the Kingdom of France as a whole, especially the north, and central northern Italy. Then, of course, you have the Kingdom of Sicily. At some point is actually richer than France. Itself, we've made a video about the various incomes of the various kingdoms. But the peak of civilization in arms, in art, in law, in theology, practically in state building, in practically everything, all right, is pioneered by, respectively, the single most monarchic and truly sort of imperially leaning power, like Capetian France, and the 30 de facto independent city-states of central northern Italy within the Holy Roman Empire. They feel they're loyal subjects to the empire, even when they bond, in fact, with France, with the papacy. There wasn't such a thing like a person going up, I just believe in the papacy, or I just believe in the empire. Sorry, like, they were both part of their, not just institutional, but metaphysical horizon. Let's not even digress on how jurisdictions worked in the Middle Ages, how they superimposed with one another. This had been the problem, again, between the papacy and the empire itself. There were lands who really controls them and how, right? To which degree can the Pope control his own arms, so to say, certain communities in the patrimonium pattern? How much is it instead an imperial prerogative that should take care of temporal matters? Like, there were debates on this, even between the papacy and the empire in peaceful terms. Look at Sutra 1115, for example, where the absolute delineation of the respective spheres of influence was at least ideally declared, even though none of the two had any mean, obviously, in a earthly sense to achieve it, but in theory, like for settling what was winding down as what we called investiture controversy, that 7 years later at Worms would be better codified. In fact, with a radical dichotomy in the repartition of the two spheres, but with things like, I don't know, and that tells you how these powers superimpose. Like, the emperor has the primacy in appointing properly investing the bishops in Germany, and the Pope has the same right in Italy, and they still do. They respectively do the same thing later after each other in the same countries at the same time. That's how, like, indissolubly entwined these powers were, right? There was an ecclesiastical jurisdiction, just like in the Carolingian Empire. Look at the Missi Dominici. Look at the count and the bishop. They are such a dichotomy that it can't be separated in a traditional world. That has a function, by the way. It's a very specific function. This is not a dysfunctional system. Actually, the competition between the papacy and the empire is what provides us with things like the recovery of Roman law, with the canon law. And even when fighting one another, it was about the person in charge, not the office, that was attacked, right? The various prerogatives of the offices were to be reduced in different ways, but not eliminating the office itself. And we tend also, when talking about the investiture controversy, to actually think that this is basically all what was going on as far as the role of the papacy and the empire, as if they were there just to molest each other. This is not true, actually. Both papacy and empire were meant to provide stability to the system. Like, the papacy, this is never said out loud, but that's literally, if you look at their diplomatic history, at what they were doing politically internationally, the purpose of the papacy is to truly bring an end, a peaceful end, to the wars between Christians, right? This is obviously not valid for the heretics, if you're wondering, but there is also a reason there why that was the case, which is not some strange sort of whim of repressive brutality. There is an actual reason why that had come to be a war to begin with, and violence flared. That's why you needed, by the way, these authorities. At some point, the system could have also succumbed to heretical chaos, but it wouldn't, thanks to these authorities. Right? If there was a war, in any case, between two Christian realms, well, the Pope had to take a specific position and had to injunct to one side or the other to stop, for reasons that are, in this sense, also documentable. We never really made videos about this, but they were very formalized and open. There were obvious issues also between the church and kings, emperors, etc., in respective countries, and that the papacy intervened. Emperors were admittedly more limited in that sense, as much as other kings, as sacred rulers themselves, were de facto tacitly delegated their power, if anything, because they were there to begin with and to make things work, right? But I don't know, a king of England, also for opportunism at some point, because they were at that time allied with the Welfen of Saxony, that were at that point vying for imperial power, would recognize imperial authority, right? This does not mean that the emperor came to dictate rule in England, right? But still, this was formally recognized. There was also a general sense of shared power. When you look at Louis IX, for example, he was understood as another great Solomon, He was a juridical expert. He was invited, including into England, to resolve some intricate institutional matters. Due to his legal insight, he was revered. It was this sense, as said before, of also dominatingly Frankish sense that matters were being resolved here not among people that belong to a kingdom, like a state separated from anything else. This is a mentality that appears only with the Reformation, as a matter of fact, in parallel with all these other changes, but also anthropological, not just ecclesiologically, or theological for that matter. It was different lords who ruled over some communities across this broader Christendom, and different rulers themselves could be more or less useful to each other to rule this world that in theory was to be understood as a wall, right? This is, again, an incredibly important concept. I don't know why, but today I exhausted myself making this video. I mean, it doesn't happen like I arrive at the end and say, oh my God, I can't go on with it. This is admittedly a long video. And it's not like I have weakened. Actually, it could go on even for other 2 hours, right? But our videos have just a certain limit, of sustainability. Tomorrow I have also to record earlier in the, after lunch, because I do something else in the evening. But in general, the idea that conceptualizing certain ideas before entering probably in the heart of it, like especially the last concept, as I was saying before, now we have to digress on or start, if anything, before providing with the actual third meanings that here we specifically listed, so to say, provided. I think is really important, and to stop at the level of conceptualization. Then we will look at the examples in another video. This will be essentially next week if everything goes as it should. And I'm glad we're having this conversation. As you know, this is obvious considering what we do on Schwerpunkt, but I know that many of you actually hear, and I hope that my videos provide you with that level of, if not of clarity, the purpose is clarifying, obviously, but I understand that these may be complex videos that not necessarily everybody has the time or the inclination to properly follow, to study, whatever. However, just know this much, that this is part of a wall, all right? I'm going to make likely, how long was this? Today. Probably even shorter than the other time. No, quite, basically almost the same, as a matter of fact. Bit shorter, yes. And so probably we'll have other 3 or 4 videos of this kind before we end it. And I, in this sense, think that we will have more than one sort of reflection to make on this wall. I think, again, it's really important. We don't make these videos for no reason, right? And I've achieved this capacity over the years to really make so many videos about, about similar topics, about the same topics at a point, surely interconnected topics that, however, can, for this very reason, be approached from so many different points of view to better dimension them, right? Is like increasing depth to the point we can fundamentally reason better on what it really means. So we've been doing fairly well. I'm also outside of Schwerpunkt working fairly well. So everything for now, what we are in the time of Taurus. So maybe that's that force that is inspiring us to continue like this. And surely we will have very interesting content upcoming. I'm really glad to see that we have more and more subscribers. This, as you know, has been going on for a while. Now we're entering in the second month of this revival that was really, I think, evident in the past 3 months, and I don't know how long it's gonna take to make this the new plateau, but I'm confident that we can definitely get there, and that this is really a structural dynamic, and we are exactly where we should be in this regard. So thanks also for all the new subscriptions. It is really really an important step forward in the history of Schwerpunkt. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.